So why is experiential learning important?
Well, Steve, I think when we think about education, we're really thinking about human beings, about people. So education's a human endeavour. So to understand it fully, we need to understand how human beings work in the world. And one term that we use to describe that is experience. So understanding experience is, if you like, a basis for understanding education. When we're thinking about big issues like engagement, we're often dealing with understandings of experience that, in educational terms, especially today, don't seem to be, if you like, the flavour of the month. We've drilled down so much into issues of accountability and
metrics,
outcomes, and things. We've sort of left the person behind. So this, experiential learning is important because we're taking into consideration experience and understanding that, which goes beyond just knowing, which we tend to connect with curriculum, and beyond just doing, which we tend to connect with pedagogy. So conversations in education are generally around curriculum and pedagogy, but it takes it to a deeper level, which is that of being. So who are the people that we're working with, and what are the worlds that we're helping to create that they inhabit in our educational institutions? So as a teacher, I'm moving beyond just working with curriculum. I'm moving beyond just working with pedagogy, but I'm doing both of those things as well. But I'm now also taking very much into consideration the person and an understanding of the person.
Today it's almost counter-culture, or almost opposite to what the de rigueur message is in education, isn't it? So would you see yourself as going or swimming against the stream a little bit?
Yeah, it's almost radical.
Which is crazy, really, because it's not, because it's been around for a long time in terms of, circa Dewey. I always remember when I was an undergrad, the lesson plan templates had learning experience in the column. So I know it has a very rich history in terms of, the term learning experience. But how would you differentiate, say, learning experience from, say, experiential learning? Are they one and the same thing, or are they different?
Well, there is the learning experience that you have in the classroom, and I use classroom fairly generically because that's often where we're working, but of course we can work outside the classroom. There's an important insight from John Dewey, which was that even in the classroom, people are having experience. So it's a certain type of experience. So often with experiential learning, we think, well, it's the opposite or very different from what's going on in the classroom. And it can be, but we can't lose sight of the fact that experience is happening in the classroom as well, and a certain type of experience. So that, I know we've got a diagram here, Steve.
Yeah, sure.
Could we flip
Let's get to that, yeah.
So, we talked about, knowing. So what is it that we want people to know? What's the content? We talked about doing, about how we come into contact with that knowledge and make sense of it. But a further encapsulating understanding is that of a way of being. So a way of being, within a way of being, we have ways of doing and ways of knowing. So if we think about this framework, then in a classroom there are ways of being as well. So, and the most common one, and it's a generalisation, but it is being a student. And being a student then in particular subjects. So if you're in secondary school as a student, you know that if you're in maths, certain expectations are there in relation to who you are, and certain understandings of what you need to do and what you need to know that are encapsulated within that. If you then move to a history class, who you are in that class is subtly different. And, the ways of doing, there may be, you may be able to use labels which make it seem as if the ways of doing are the same in maths and and in history like, you know, writing into a notebook. But if you get to the more subtle detail there, you know, often in history there's a lot more conversation than in mathematics, etc., which positions that knowledge in a certain way. It means something within those practices, within that way of being a person. But we while we're very happy as teachers and educators to talk about curriculum and pedagogy, we don't really have a language, and we don't really think about you know, who we're asking these people to be. But our understanding of who they are allows us to you know, organise our curriculum and pedagogy. So we have an understanding. You know, the secondary school teacher of mathematics will have a good understanding of what a maths student is. You know, and so they'll set their expectations in relation to that. So the young people who come into that class come into it thinking, well, I've got to be, you know, knowing that I've got to be the good maths student in here, or that's the expectation. But that doesn't really come into our conversation as teachers and educators. And this point became clear to me when I was thinking about you know, core academic curriculum, so subjects in the curriculum like mathematics, science, English, history, geography, etc., that are sort of core academic work, and others. But then when you contrast that with the co-curricular program that operates at schools, and we tend to sort of perceive that juxtaposition of curricular and co-curricular as if one is about knowing, the core curriculum is about knowing, and the other one's about doing. And you notice that in many schools, those programs don't actually talk to each other. We just have this separation between knowing and doing. So another way of thinking about that juxtaposition is that in both of those strands, we do work with being. So being a mathematics student, being a science student, being an English student, but being a member of the football team, being in the school production, being in the brass ensemble, all these co-curricular activities, as well as the core curriculum. So it gives us a language for looking at the school more holistically, recognising that there are ways of doing and knowing within the co-curricular, and that there are also ways of being associated with the core curricular subjects, but we don't often think of that way. And that's how the young people that if we're thinking about schools or universities or any educational situation, that's how the people that we're working with, we're positioning them in the present. So you know, time, there's an issue of time, but the present, there's a bit with experiential learning, there's an important issue of, you know, the present and the future. Because you know, if we take again that normal classroom situation, we're not so concerned about who the young people are, because we think this is all just preparation for when they leave school. So as teachers, we're sort of happy to just try to squeeze them into the box of being a good student in whatever subject there is, because we believe it's for their best interest in, you know, getting a high mark so they can get into the university course they want to, and vocationally then move into a way of being that
it's very instrumentally focused.
Yeah.
It's all about acquisition of skill, you know, but they talk about it as like it's a skill, like riding a bike. When it's probably the wrong way of actually thinking about, you know, about being inculcated into a tradition. I know that's very different from what you're talking about, but I'm just thinking about in terms of you know, in terms of a discipline area, and you talked about maths and science, about being inculcated into a tradition. That's something of revolving around that notion of being that you're kind of talking about. There's that existential element, which is really what I hear you saying to me. Just quickly before, because you have answered my second question around what is experiential learning, just through your explanation here, through your diagram, so thanks for that. Can you just talk to the listeners a little bit more about where your ideas originate from here in relation to this diagram? Obviously, there's an interrelationship that's happening here. We are obviously talking about existential type things or concepts in relation to being. So if you just talk a little bit about that for those people out there a little bit unsure about about this concept of being, because I'm sure there'd be a lot of people who may be a little bit skeptical and go, look, this is very abstract, this is very esoterical, and that will just kind of get us to our next question as well. So,
yes, being's an interesting word, and when I use it, I mean it in an active sense. So it's like being. It's more like a verb than a noun. So, here we are being.
It's not a state. It's not a fixed state.
No, not a fixed state at all. And being. We think of human beings. We tend to use when we use the plural, it becomes more a noun. Maybe one other way to think about it is being human. But in being human, that there's many ways to be a human being. So we could be as we said, a good mathematics student. We could be a good football player. We could be a good, or we could be, even taking out the word good, trying to qualify it like that. We could be a teacher, a teacher of mathematics. We could be academics working at university. We could be, thinking back to the school situation, when young people go on school camp, all the different ways of being that are on offer there. A myriad of ways of being sort of in that sort of rich setting. And then you move outside of sort of school itself and think of all the ways of being a person that young people are at home, and they're a sibling, they're a son or a daughter.
Yeah, there's clear correlations and crossover with sociology in terms of where people occupy certain spheres in their lives, and that we move from spheres to spheres. For example, I'm a husband, married with 4 children. And then obviously I, move from a family sphere to a working sphere, so on and so forth.
So you're moving between, and so that yourself, who you are in a general sense, is constituted by these. And as we get older, our repertoire of ways of being a person expands. And I think especially around those middle school years, that's where young people, their purpose is, in a sense, to expand their repertoire of who they are. And that's where we let them down a bit at school, where we more focus them on just learning more disciplinary knowledge, in a sense. Many schools now in those middle school years have electives, and in order to sort of try to cater for young people's interest in moving beyond the normal curriculum, but not necessarily a theoretical framework for understanding why it is that they're doing that. So, in a lot of ways, those electives, and they're rich and interesting, are setting up, ways of being a person that do connect with young people, in their more open and everyday and rich lives. So rather than say being a mathematics student, which is sort of set up so that we can focus on this mathematical knowing, we set up subjects, electives that do connect with young people, but we forget this bit, and we tend to think these electives are really more about doing, whereas all of this is in play at the same time.
See, I think a lot of the reason why there's a focus, if you like, here in the ways of doing is more a case of because it can be measured. In the performativity culture of education today, it's easily measurable. Well, we'd like to think it's easily measurable anyway. And so I can understand why there might be a disproportionate focus on that. But look, we're digressing a little bit there. And I was being intentional too, by the way, in terms of those sociological spheres, because obviously there's a very strong existential element when I'm a member or belong or part of a particular tradition or a sphere. There's a very strong existential element. So, of course, I was being intentional there.
I agree.
Now, let's move on, because I'm conscious of the time. Now, for those skeptics out there, or those pre-service teachers, or anyone who's just a little bit unsure here, let's just get to this next question and we'll finish up here. And then this is kind of like an application type question.